Throughout history, royal heirs have been groomed for greatness, trained from birth to carry the weight of empires, shaped by tutors and tradition, molded into perfect symbols of power and continuity. But what happens when the heir refuses to fit the mold? When the crown prince meant to save a dynasty becomes its greatest tragedy. On January 30th, 1889, a cold winter morning shattered the Austrian Empire. At a remote hunting lodge called Mayerling, deep in the Vienna woods, servants discovered a scene that would send shockwaves across Europe. Behind a locked bedroom door lay Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria-Hungary, the heir to one of the world's most powerful thrones. Beside him was the body of his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera. Both had been shot. Both were dead. Within hours, the imperial court locked down the story. The press was muzzled. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses were silenced. The official version was suicide by temporary insanity. But the whispers told a darker tale: murder, conspiracy, forbidden love, and political intrigue that reached the highest levels of European power. Some said Rudolf had made a death pact with his young lover. Others claimed he was assassinated by enemies of the empire. A few whispered that the emperor himself had ordered his son's death to prevent a scandal that could destroy the monarchy. Rudolf was 30 years old, brilliant, troubled, and dangerously liberal in an empire built on tradition. He had everything: wealth, privilege, power waiting to be inherited. Yet he threw it all away in one violent, mysterious night. This is the story of Crown Prince Rudolf, the heir who was never meant to be king, the reformer trapped in a reactionary empire, and the man whose death became Austria's most enduring mystery. A story of passion, betrayal, and a bullet that changed the course of history. Rudolf Franz Karl Joseph was born on August 21st, 1858, at Laxenburg Palace, near Vienna. His birth was celebrated across the empire. After nearly a decade of marriage, Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth finally had their male heir. Cannons fired. Churches rang their bells. The dynasty's future seemed secure. The empire had its crown prince, the boy who would one day rule over 50 million subjects across a dozen nations and languages. But from his first breath, Rudolf was caught in a war he couldn't win. His parents' marriage was already crumbling under the weight of incompatibility and duty. Franz Joseph was the embodiment of Habsburg tradition, rigid, formal, obsessed with military discipline and absolute authority. He rose at 4 a.m. every day to work through mountains of paperwork, personally signing every military promotion and minor bureaucratic document. He believed in divine right, unquestioning obedience, and the preservation of the old order at all costs. Elizabeth, known as Sisi, was his opposite in every way: beautiful, restless, and suffocating under the weight of court protocol. She loved poetry, travel, and freedom. She despised the stifling rituals of the Viennese court and the iron control of her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who had essentially stolen her first 2 daughters and raised them according to Habsburg tradition. Elizabeth spent her life fleeing Vienna, traveling to Hungary, Greece, England, anywhere but the Hofburg Palace, where she felt imprisoned. Rudolf became the rope in their tug-of-war. Elizabeth adored her son with a fierce protectiveness, seeing in him a chance to raise a child her own way, free from Sophie's interference. But she was often absent, traveling the world to escape her unhappy marriage and maintain her legendary beauty and impossibly tiny waist. Franz Joseph loved Rudolf, but had no idea how to show it beyond imposing the same harsh discipline that had shaped him. The emperor believed that royal children should be raised like soldiers, tough, obedient, emotionless. Affection was weakness. Tenderness was dangerous. So he assigned Rudolf's education to Count Leopold Gondrecourt, a military officer known for his brutality and his belief that aristocratic boys needed to be broken like horses before they could be properly trained. What followed was nothing short of child abuse, sanctioned by imperial decree. Gondrecourt's methods were medieval. He woke the young prince with gunfire fired directly outside his bedroom window to toughen him and rid him of cowardice. He forced Rudolf to take ice-cold baths in the dead of winter and march for hours in the rain without proper clothing. Most horrifically, he would lock the terrified boy in the game park at Laxenburg at night, alone in the darkness with wild boars roaming freely, to teach him courage and self-reliance. The boy was terrified. He began waking up screaming from nightmares. He developed nervous tremors and began sleepwalking through the palace corridors. His health deteriorated rapidly. He lost weight, became withdrawn, and showed signs of what we would now recognize as severe anxiety and post-traumatic stress. When Elizabeth finally discovered what was happening during one of her rare visits home, she was furious beyond measure. She threatened to leave Franz Joseph permanently if Gondrecourt wasn't dismissed immediately. The emperor, shocked by his wife's rage and perhaps finally recognizing the damage being done to his heir, relented. Gondrecourt was removed, and Rudolf's education was placed in the gentler hands of more progressive tutors. But the damage was done. The scars ran deep. Rudolf would struggle with anxiety, depression, chronic insomnia, and a terror of his father for the rest of his life. The boy who should have been emperor learned early that his father's world was one of cruelty disguised as strength, of violence masquerading as love, and that lesson would poison everything that came after. As Rudolf grew older, his tutors noticed something remarkable. He was brilliant, not just intelligent, but intellectually hungry in a way his father had never been and could never understand. He spoke German, Hungarian, Czech, French, and English fluently by his teenage years. He devoured books on history, philosophy, natural sciences, and political theory with an appetite that alarmed his conservative instructors. He wrote essays on politics and social reform that were astonishingly mature and dangerously progressive for someone of his age and position. His tutors included some of the empire's finest minds. After Gondrecourt's dismissal, Colonel Joseph Latour von Thurmberg became his new tutor, a far gentler educator who introduced him to the natural sciences and liberal political thought. Then, in 1876, when Rudolf was 18, Karl Menger, founder of the Austrian School of Economics, was appointed to teach him political economy. Menger's lectures on markets, property rights, and economic freedom profoundly shaped Rudolf's liberal worldview. The two even co-authored an anonymous pamphlet in 1878, criticizing the Austrian aristocracy's decadence. From these mentors, Rudolf absorbed ideas that were fundamentally incompatible with his father's worldview. But his brilliance was dangerous in the Habsburg court. While Franz Joseph clung to absolute monarchy and divine right, believing that God had personally chosen the Habsburgs to rule, and that any challenge to their authority was both sinful and treasonous, Rudolf embraced Enlightenment ideals and scientific rationalism. He believed in constitutional government, freedom of the press, secular education, and most radical of all, the rights of the empire's ethnic minorities to self-determination. He read banned liberal newspapers smuggled into the palace and corresponded secretly with journalists, scientists, and intellectuals his father despised as dangerous radicals. He argued passionately that Austria-Hungary needed to modernize or face revolution. He could see what his father refused to acknowledge, that the empire was a patchwork of resentful nations, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Italians, Romanians, Serbs, Croatians, all chafing under German-Austrian domination. Rudolf believed the empire could survive only by transforming itself into a genuine federation where each nationality had autonomy and representation. His father saw this as madness, a betrayal of everything the Habsburgs represented. The gulf between father and son grew into a chasm. They clashed constantly over politics, policy, and philosophy. Rudolf wanted reform and progress. Franz Joseph wanted obedience and tradition. The emperor began excluding his son from important state meetings and military decisions, convinced the boy's liberal infection made him unfit for serious governance. Rudolf, in turn, grew bitter and resentful, watching from the sidelines as his father's outdated policies pushed the empire closer to the edge of disaster. In 1881, at 23, Rudolf was pressured into a political marriage he never wanted. His bride was Princess Stephanie of Belgium, the daughter of King Leopold II, one of history's most brutal colonial monarchs. She was just 16, naive, sheltered, and completely unprepared for the sophisticated and cynical world of the Viennese court. The marriage was arranged for political reasons, strengthening ties between Austria and Belgium, and neither bride nor groom had any say in the matter. It was a disaster from the start. Rudolf found Stephanie dull, provincial, and intellectually unstimulating. She had been raised in the isolated Belgian court with little education and even less preparation for becoming a crown princess. Stephanie, for her part, was hurt and confused by Rudolf's coldness and his obvious disinterest in her. She'd married expecting romance and found only duty. Within months, Rudolf was openly conducting affairs with actresses, aristocrats, and prostitutes. Stephanie retreated into wounded dignity and religious devotion. They managed to produce one child, Archduchess Elizabeth, born in 1883. But even this brief moment of hope turned to tragedy when Rudolf contracted gonorrhea from one of his mistresses and unknowingly infected his wife, leaving her unable to have more children. The revelation destroyed whatever remained of their relationship. The required male heir would never come. Their marriage became a cold formality, two strangers living in the same palace, attending the same functions, but existing in completely separate worlds. Rudolf spiraled deeper into self-destruction. He drank heavily, consuming champagne and cognac at all hours of the day. He took morphine and cocaine to cope with his chronic insomnia, depression, and the constant pain in his head from mysterious headaches that doctors couldn't explain. His behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. He would disappear for days at a time, frequenting Vienna's brothels, gambling dens, and opium parlors, shocking even the permissive standards of aristocratic Vienna. He wrote letters filled with dark, nihilistic thoughts about death and the meaninglessness of existence. He spoke openly about suicide to friends and lovers, asking women he was involved with if they would die with him. Most thought he was being dramatic, playing the tortured romantic, but looking back, the signs were unmistakable. Rudolf was a man in profound psychological crisis, and nobody, not his father, not his doctors, not his friends, knew how to save him. Then, in 1888, Rudolf met Mary Wetzera. She was just 17, the daughter of a wealthy but minor noble family. By all accounts, she was enchanting, dark-haired, romantic, and utterly infatuated with the crown prince. For Rudolf, who had grown cynical about love and life, Mary must have seemed like an escape. She adored him without reservation. She didn't care about politics or duty. She only wanted him. Their affair began in secret. They met at parties, exchanged passionate letters, and rendezvoused in private apartments arranged by Rudolf's allies. Mary's mother, Baroness Helene Wetzera, was horrified when she discovered the relationship. She knew an affair with the married crown prince would destroy her daughter's reputation and prospects. She tried everything to separate them, but Mary was obsessed. In her diary, she wrote about Rudolf as if he were a god. She fantasized about dying with him, about their love transcending earthly limitations. Rudolf, meanwhile, was sinking deeper into darkness. By late 1888, his political frustrations had reached a breaking point. He'd written inflammatory articles for liberal newspapers under a pseudonym, attacking his father's alliance with Germany and advocating for closer ties with France. When the emperor discovered this, he was furious. There were heated confrontations. Some historians believe Franz Joseph threatened to strip Rudolf of his succession rights, or even exile him. Rudolf also faced pressure from another quarter. He'd apparently become involved in a conspiracy with Hungarian nationalists who wanted to break free from Austrian control. Rudolf sympathized with their cause and may have promised to support Hungarian independence once he became emperor. But if his involvement was exposed, it would be seen as treason. The stakes couldn't have been higher. By January 1889, Rudolf was trapped. His marriage was dead. His relationship with his father was beyond repair. His political ambitions were blocked. He was addicted to drugs and alcohol. And he had a teenage mistress whose family was demanding an end to the affair. In letters to friends, he wrote cryptically about a solution he'd found, about how he'd soon be free. On January 28, 1889, Rudolf invited a small hunting party to Mayerling, his personal lodge about 25 miles from Vienna. The guests included his brother-in-law, Prince Philip of Coburg, his friend, Count Joseph Hoyos, and his hunting companion, Count Johann Salvator. The atmosphere was strange. Rudolf seemed distracted, drinking heavily, making dark jokes about death. At one point, he reportedly asked his brother-in-law to take care of his wife and daughter after he was gone. That evening, Mary Wetzera arrived secretly. Rudolf had arranged for her to be smuggled to Mayerling in a closed carriage. Her mother had no idea where she'd gone. At the lodge, Mary and Rudolf spent their final night together. What they discussed, what promises they made, what despair or passion filled those hours, we'll never know for certain. The next morning, January 30th, Rudolf's valet knocked on the bedroom door for breakfast. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. By 8 a.m., the household was worried. Count Hoyos and the lodge's administrator, Johann Loschek, finally broke down the door. The scene inside was horrific. Rudolf lay on his bed, a revolver near his hand, a bullet wound in his right temple. Blood soaked the sheets. Across from him, on a small sofa, lay Mary Wetzera. She'd been shot in the head as well. The room reeked of gunpowder and death. Panic erupted. Hoyos raced back to Vienna to inform the emperor. Meanwhile, Loschek and the others sealed the room and began what can only be described as a cover-up. The imperial court went into crisis mode. The emperor's first concern wasn't grief or justice, it was image. A crown prince who'd committed suicide would be denied a Catholic burial. A crown prince who'd murdered his mistress before killing himself was unthinkable. The scandal had to be contained. Within hours, the official story was crafted. Rudolf had died of heart failure. Then, when that proved impossible to maintain, the story shifted. He'd killed himself in a moment of temporary insanity, which would allow a church burial. Mary Wetzera's body was treated even more callously. Under cover of darkness, her corpse was dressed, propped up between two men, and smuggled out of Mayerling in a carriage. She was secretly buried in a small cemetery at Heiligenkreuz, without ceremony, without her family present. The press was muzzled. Newspapers across Austria were ordered to print only the official version. Foreign correspondents were expelled. Anyone who knew the truth was sworn to secrecy. The lodge at Mayerling was immediately converted into a Carmelite convent, a permanent memorial, or perhaps a permanent burial of evidence. But secrets have a way of leaking. Within days, Rumors swept through Vienna. People whispered about the girl, about the bullet wounds, about the locked door, and the strange behavior in Rudolf's final days. As news spread across Europe, the theories multiplied. Was it a suicide pact? A crime of passion? Murder disguised as suicide? Had enemies of the empire assassinated the liberal crown prince to prevent reform? Had French agents killed him to punish Austria's alliance with Germany? Some even whispered that Franz Joseph himself had ordered his son's death to prevent a catastrophic scandal or political betrayal. The investigation, if it can be called that, was a farce. No autopsy report was made public. Key witnesses were never questioned properly. Evidence disappeared. Rudolf's personal papers were burned. Mary Wetzera's letters vanished. Even the revolver used in the deaths was never properly examined. The imperial court wanted one thing: silence. But the silence only deepened the mystery. In the years that followed, theories about Mayerling became one of Europe's great obsessions. Forensic experts, historians, and conspiracy theorists have spent over a century trying to uncover what really happened in that locked room. The most common explanation is a double suicide pact. Rudolf, consumed by depression, drugs, and despair, convinced the infatuated Mary to die with him. He shot her first, then himself. This fits with Mary's diary entries about wanting to die with Rudolf, and with reports that he'd asked other women to die with him in the weeks before Mayerling. It also explains the locked door and the absence of signs of struggle. But there are problems with this theory. Why would Rudolf choose such a violent, public method if he simply wanted to escape? Why involve Mary at all? And why did the imperial court work so hard to suppress evidence if it was merely a tragic suicide? Some historians argue the cover-up was about protecting Rudolf's reputation and ensuring his Catholic burial, not hiding murder. The assassination theories are more dramatic but harder to prove. Some claim Rudolf was killed by agents of the Vatican, who feared his liberal politics and hostility to church power. Others point to political enemies within Austria, who saw him as a dangerous radical. A few argue that German or French spies were involved, punishing or preventing Rudolf's political maneuvering. But no concrete evidence has ever emerged to support these claims. Perhaps the darkest theory is that Franz Joseph was involved. Did the emperor, faced with a son who threatened to destroy the empire with scandal or treason, order him eliminated? It's almost too terrible to imagine. But in a monarchy where image was everything, where the dynasty's survival outweighed individual lives, could it have happened? Most historians dismiss this as impossible, pointing to Franz Joseph's grief after Rudolf's death. But the complete destruction of evidence and the brutal efficiency of the cover-up do raise questions about who had the power to orchestrate such a thing. In 1991, Mary Wetzera's body was exhumed from her grave at Heiligenkreuz. Forensic experts examined her skull, hoping to finally solve the mystery. They found evidence of a gunshot wound consistent with suicide or close-range murder, but nothing definitive. The bones raised as many questions as they answered, and Rudolf's body, buried in the imperial crypt in Vienna, has never been exhumed. The Habsburg family has refused all requests. Whatever secrets his remains might tell are locked away forever. The death at Mayerling destroyed more than 2 lives. It shattered the Habsburg dynasty's future. Franz Joseph, who had ruled for 40 years expecting Rudolf to succeed him, was suddenly without an heir. The throne would eventually pass to Franz Joseph's nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And Franz Ferdinand's assassination in Sarajevo in 1914 would trigger World War I and the final collapse of the Austrian Empire. Some historians argue that Rudolf's death changed the course of history. Had he lived, Austria might have embraced reform instead of rigidity. Rudolf's liberal politics and sympathy for ethnic minorities might have prevented the empire's disintegration, or perhaps his idealism would have been crushed by reality, and he would have become just another autocrat. We'll never know. For Franz Joseph, Mayerling was a wound that never healed. He rarely spoke of his son. The lodge, now a convent, became a place he avoided. He ruled for another 27 years, growing older and more isolated, watching his empire crumble piece by piece. When he died in 1916, in the middle of World War I, he left behind a dynasty in ruins and a mystery that would outlive them all. As for Mary Wetzera, she became a tragic footnote, the teenage girl who died for love, or was murdered for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her family was shamed and silenced. Her grave became a pilgrimage site for romantics, but her voice, her truth, was buried with her. Throughout history, royal heirs have been groomed for greatness, trained from birth to carry the weight of empires, shaped by tutors and tradition, molded into perfect symbols of power and continuity. But what happens when the heir refuses to fit the mold? When the crown prince meant to save a dynasty becomes its greatest tragedy? Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria-Hungary was supposed to be the future. Instead, he became a ghost. The liberal reformer crushed by an empire that couldn't change. The brilliant mind destroyed by drugs, depression, and duty. The romantic who died in a locked room with a 17-year-old girl, leaving behind questions that will never be answered. Was it suicide? Murder? A crime of passion? Or a political assassination? More than a century later, we still don't know. The evidence was destroyed. The witnesses are dead. The truth died with Rudolf and Mary in that blood-soaked bedroom at Mayerling. But perhaps the real tragedy isn't the mystery of how he died. It's the certainty of how he lived. A man born to rule, trained to be emperor, yet never trusted with power. A reformer silenced by the very system he wanted to fix. An heir who became a warning. In the rigid world of Imperial Austria, even princes weren't free. And when they tried to break free, the empire buried them, alive or dead, in silence. The man they called the hope of the empire died at 30. The empire that killed him, whether through neglect, conspiracy, or crushing conformity, outlived him by only 3 decades. In the end, Rudolf's death at Mayerling was just a preview. The real tragedy was still to come. Rudolf's story didn't end at Mayerling. It echoes through every royal family that chose image over truth, silence over justice. And his story isn't alone. The Habsburg dynasty is filled with forgotten figures whose lives were just as dramatic, just as tragic, and just as deliberately buried by history. If you want to uncover more of these hidden scandals, the mad queens, the exiled archdukes, the secret lovers and political prisoners who lived and died behind palace walls, then you're in the right place. Here at the Forgotten Court, we dig up the stories they wanted you to forget, the ones too messy, too human, too real for the official histories. So if you enjoyed unraveling the mystery of Mayerling, hit that subscribe button, because next time we're going even deeper into the Habsburg vault. And trust me, what we find there will make Rudolf's story look tame. The crown has secrets, and we're just getting started.